Welcome back to another episode of Podcast on the Brink. Just 2 days until Indiana's exhibition opener this Saturday at Simon Scott Assembly Hall. The Hoosiers will welcome Marian University. To tie in there, obviously, Steve Downing, former Indiana basketball player, is the athletic director at Marian University. So a great opportunity for them to come to Assembly Hall and get to play in the environment there. And for Indiana, it's first of two exhibition games to open the season. To help us preview this weekend's exhibition opener and also talk some other preseason topics, Tyler Tachman of the Indianapolis Star is back on Podcast on the Brink. How you doing today, Tyler?
I'm doing great. How about yourself?
I'm doing well. So looking forward to Saturday. Obviously, the outcome of the game is not in much doubt, but everyone I think is excited to see, a first glimpse at this group of Indiana Hoosiers. It's been a long time now since we last saw this team play a game, and it wasn't the best experience for fans watching what happened to this group against St. Mary's in the NCAA tournament out in Portland. But expectations, obviously, at a high level. What will you be watching for on Saturday in terms of what this team looks like on the court? And is there anything in particular you're looking forward to seeing in your first viewing of the 2022-23 team?
I guess some of it is just the storylines that we've been talking about leading into the season. Like, how does Jordan Geronimo look handling the ball? Does he look like he has the versatility to play the three? Is Trace able to take a shot from 10, 15 feet? If there's any time to practice that in as close, a game-like situation, pretty much, these exhibitions would be the opportunity to do so. I'm interested to see some different lineups. How do Xavier Johnson and Jalen Hood-Schifino look together if Mike Woodson elects to put them on the court at the same time? Have they already developed a chemistry? So those are, I think, just kind of mixing and matching lineups. I'd like to see in, Mike Woodson play the freshmen more, just because I'm interested to see kind of how their skill sets have translated so far. And this is, like I said, a good time to do it, low stakes against an opponent that Indiana shouldn't really have much trouble beating, but really mixing, matching lineups. Some of the younger guys, some of the guys we haven't seen us play as much, like Logan Duncomb, just to see. We've heard that he's made some significant strides. Let's see it out on the court. So I guess just some of those storylines we've been talking about the last few months. I'm just kind of curious to see that first look of how far they are on in that development process.
Yeah, I think it's important, as you mentioned, for the freshmen to get an opportunity to get some reps in. It's something we haven't really seen in recent seasons. Looking back, a couple of years ago, when the schedule was shortened due to COVID, there wasn't really much of a ramp up to the season. Last year, I don't believe Indiana played an exhibition game at home. I think they were scheduled to play two secret scrimmages. They actually played one, and the other one got canceled, and so they went right into the regular season. That was the first time we saw them play. So the idea here of playing two exhibitions and getting everybody some early reps on the team, particularly one that a lot of people feel the depth could be a strength of this group, to have an opportunity to mix and match different lineups and give guys an opportunity. I agree with you. It'll be important for the freshmen. One of those freshmen that I wanted to ask you about, because we've obviously talked about him quite a bit, written about him. You wrote about him at Inside the Hall. I'm sure you're going to write about him at Indy Star. His story very well. Jalen Hood-Schifino. It feels like the hype was pretty big all summer. It seems like it's kind of kicked into another gear now. Recently, there's been some, there was a story that I retweeted the other day, just talking about his NBA draft stock potential that a lot of people read and it got them excited. Andy Katz had him, I think, number 13 on his list of top Big Ten players entering the season. Seemed a little bit ambitious just based on what we know so far. I mean, obviously, I think it's a great development for Indiana if that comes to fruition, and he is the 13th best player in the league. That really changes the ceiling of this team. But Jalen Hood-Schifino, what, Tyler, are you expecting from him this season, just in terms of not a specific stat line, but how much of an impact can he make, and what do you think his role looks like? Because I'm looking at this team and I know Trace Jackson Davis, Race Thompson, Xavier Johnson, reasonably what we can expect from all those guys. I don't think their minutes are going to change much. I think they're all going to produce probably at a similar level to what we saw last season. So it doesn't really feel like there's like a ton of room for somebody to just emerge and score 15, 20 points a game. I don't think we're going to see that from Hood-Schifino, but how can he be impactful for this team from day one? Maybe by doing some other things, and ultimately, what do you kind of see his role being in his first season?
In my opinion, I guess the ceiling for him is Big Ten Freshman of the Year. And I think, maybe the opposite end of that would be that you kind of see him go through the same struggles that Tamar Bates went through last season. I don't know if it was as much hype. It was probably similar hype for Tamar Bates coming in last season as a highly touted guy at a high school. And we know he definitely had his ups and downs last season. But the thing that I like about Jalen Hood-Schifino is his ability to do a little bit of everything. He can create for others. He can score. If his shot is consistent, he can score on all three levels. And he's a guy that can make plays on the defensive end. And so it's almost sort of like a Swiss Army knife. Like, he's a big guard too. And the point I was making last night was, I feel like that versatility out of a guard, or I guess you could say guard, maybe wing, is something that Indiana really lacked last season. And that's where I feel like, I don't know how much or not, people want to hear about Armaan Franklin, but when he broke out his second season at IU, he was that versatile guard that could do about anything. He could play defense. He could get into the lane. He could create for others. He could shoot from the outside. And then, he went to Virginia, obviously. And I feel like last season, the issue with some of IU's kind of guards and wings was that they just were mostly one-dimensional. Parker Stewart could shoot well from the outside. Offensively, didn't offer a whole lot. I think he struggled on defense as well. Miller Kopp, you could kind of say the same thing. He improved on defense, but Trey Galloway can slash and create for others, get to the rim, but wasn't consistently shooting from three. I think that kind of versatility out of a guard is something that Indiana really lacked, and it was noticeable. It just that hole that Armaan leaving and not having a guy that can kind of do anything from the guard or wing position. So I think Jalen Hood-Schifino is a guy that can kind of be that Swiss Army knife that can do a bunch of things, whether that be offensively, defensively. I think for me, the biggest question mark for him going into the season is the 3-point shooting. If he can establish that, I think that he's going to be very hard to stop. And another thing too is, like, when you look at him and Malik, is that they're both just really physically mature for their ages. Like, they don't look like freshmen. They look like guys with the bodies ready to compete in the Big Ten. So I think when you're talking about transition from high school to college, obviously they both went to Montverde, so they have that kind of already college preparation. But I think that the way that they're built physically should help that transition.
From what you know of Hood-Schifino, from your reporting and from talking to his mom, I know you've talked to her for stories in the past, and just his background, how do you think he handles the hype and the expectations this season? It's one thing to know that something you're going to be counted on, but once the games actually start, and these games, there's a little bit of a ramp up period, but a month from now, we're going to be getting ready for North Carolina and Indiana, and then all of a sudden it's going to be Kansas and Arizona. These are going to be pretty big spots early in the season that are tough for any college basketball player, let alone a freshman with high expectations. Do you think his background at Montverde and the level of basketball he's been playing for a long time has him prepared for this, or do you think there's going to be moments where he's going to look like any other freshman would, and maybe have an off game or two, and how will he respond to something like that?
I mean, I'm not going to say that he would never have a game where he looks, or a moment that looks like he's a freshman, because I feel like that's just kind of inevitable for any young player. But I feel like he's mature beyond his years in terms of just how he handles himself, how he handles life. One of the things that stood out to me was he has a little like catchphrase saying, "This is failure is no option," which is Fino, which is so Schifino. And from his last name, or from part of his last name, and that's a mindset that he him and his mom kind of have carried themselves by. And just I asked him about that at media day, and and he was also talking about, like, I asked him, like, what is his why? Like, athletes have, anyone really has their why they push themselves to do things. And he said, like, his mom and his little sister, like, those are, obviously he said, like, some of his other family members, but those are the two people that are like really rock solid in his life, and he wants to make it for them. And so I feel like in a lot of ways he's like, because when we've heard Tamar talk, like, he's very mature, the way he kind of expresses things he's going through, his perspective, all that, and especially with him having a kid. I feel like Jalen Hood-Schifino is kind of built from that same mold, to where the way he carries himself, kind of a charisma he has, he just doesn't talk like someone that's a freshman. He seems to just have not only a good grasp on basketball, but just a good grasp on life and what it takes to be successful as a basketball player and as a person. So I think, having that will help him kind of navigate the potential peaks and valleys. And then, having his support system there with his family and his mom as well. So, yeah, I guess that's what I can say. I feel like that kind of mindset, that, the Fino, failure is no option. I think that is something that can be important when you kind of try to just navigate everything as freshman season.
Yeah, I think it's one thing. You make a really good point there, just kind of his background and his why. I think the overriding theme that I've noticed from getting to know these families of the freshmen just a little bit, just from talking to parents and AAU coaches and others around them, all of these four freshmen come from really good backgrounds and have solid foundations, and it's not hard to see why they've ended up in the positions that they've ended up in, because all of them are really good kids and they've come from families who have supported them and really helped them grow. So I think that's one really thing to point out, and applaud the coaching staff for. You obviously want to get great players, but I also think if you can get great players who are great people, I think that's kind of how you change the culture of your program, and you build that way. And so as you talked about Hood-Schifino there a little bit, that was the first thing that kind of popped up in my mind. It's not just him; it's all these four freshmen. I think have that. Will they all be as impactful as Jalen this season? Probably not. But I think as you look into future seasons, guys like Caleb Banks and CJ Gunn, I think, can really help you maybe 2 or 3 years down the line be leaders as upperclassmen in your program. And that's definitely what you want as you look to build a program. One other storyline that I just wanted to ask you about, Tyler, and it came up at Indiana's media day last month. I feel like it was something everyone that was there picked up on, tweeted about, wrote about a little bit. And now that the season is here, I feel like it could disappear pretty quickly. The emergence of Logan Duncomb over the summer and in the fall, he was talked about, by Race Thompson and Trace Jackson Davis at media day. It sounded to me like they expected him to have a role on this team and play. And then you start to look at the depth chart for this team, and most teams in college basketball, the best ones, are going to play 8 or 9 guys when it comes down to the crunch time. And I don't see Logan Duncomb, at least on paper, as being one of those 8 or 9 guys for Indiana. Where do you kind of, stand on his role going into the season? Was that just kind of Indiana's way of making him feel good, about himself into the fall and projecting him, obviously into the future? He's going to be important potentially next season when you think about Race Thompson and Trace moving on, and they don't have a big man committed for next season. I just wonder if that's a storyline that kind of was manufactured for media day and we quickly forget about it when the season tips off and Logan Duncombe's the 12th or 13th man, or do you actually see a scenario where he's going to be on the court regularly for Indiana this season?
I will say that it looks like he's gained some weight, which is good for trying to hold up in the Big Ten. And we saw last season, he has a good jump shot. You know, it's pretty smooth. It looks like he has the ability to kind of stretch the floor a little bit, which is good as we kind of continue to evolve to the modern game. But I guess from his standpoint, Indiana needs to fill in that backup big man role this season. Like who's going to be the one to step up, because that's the last 2 seasons Indiana has missed that pretty much the entire time. You go back to 2 seasons ago, Joey Brunk went out, didn't play the entire season. And so that just put a lot more pressure on Trace and Race. And I think Jerome Hunter played the foursome as well. But you didn't have that guy coming off the bench to provide you maybe 6 points, 4 boards. You know, it doesn't need to be an insane stat line. It just needs to be something that's going to give Race and Trace a little bit of a break. And then you go back to last season. I think many people were hoping Michael Durr was going to be that guy. It wasn't really, it didn't kind of turn out that way. He was a big reason that Indiana beat Purdue when they played in Bloomington, but in large part, he wasn't that guy to come off the bench. And so now I'm looking at this season. Maybe Logan Duncomb can be the guy. I think maybe Malik Renew can be the guy as well. So maybe you're looking at those two competing for minutes, you know, to some degree. I think if Malik Renew emerges as a guy that's going to get a lot of minutes and maybe Logan Duncomb doesn't play as much, I don't know if you could stick them on the court at the same time. But yeah, I see just who, you know, maybe I think Logan Duncomb is in the mix to get minutes in that backup role. Now, the other thing is he just doesn't have a lot of game experience at the college level. He rarely even played last season. So I think that's another thing to take into account. And obviously Malik Renew doesn't have a lot of college experience either, but who's going to be that guy to fill in that backup role to take some pressure off of Race and Trace? And then you talk about injuries. If someone gets hurt, I could see Logan, sliding into a role there. So the fact that it does seem like he has been making progress is good, because, you know, there's probably going to be guys that have to deal with injuries. So that's just part of the game. But I don't see like really any downsides of the fact that his teammates are talking him up. You know, it seems like if anything, there's no really loss in it.
No, I mean, I'm not presenting it as a downside necessarily. I'm just saying every year at media day, it feels like there's 1 or 2 things that get talked about a lot. And this year it seems like one of them. And I'm just curious how significant that's actually going to be when the season tips off, because the other guy you didn't mention is Jordan Geronimo. And he can also, I think, against a lot of teams, play the 4 or the 5. Especially in these early non-conference games where you don't have maybe the size of a team like a Kansas or North Carolina, you can definitely throw Geronimo in there at the 4 or the 5, and he played the 4 primarily last year, and not lose much. So I think big picture with Logan Duncomb, I think the key this season is to get him some game experience, even if it's 5 or 6 minutes a game here and there. Because he didn't play at all last season. It was really a wasted year. In many ways, he probably should have just redshirted because he burned a year for no reason. Think back to the Northwestern game last year. Indiana didn't even have enough really players to play the game, and he didn't get in. And if he wasn't going to play then, we knew at that point his role was basically to not play all season. And so this year, I think the important thing, as I said, is for him to get experience, because when you look forward to next season, I know everyone is focused on this year, but when you're looking at the long-term development of the program, you got to have some front court players for next year with some experience. And I think this year the important thing for him is to get those reps and be ready when his name is called. I think he's going to have some moments this year. Going back to his high school career, watching his film, I really thought highly of him coming out of high school. I know he had caught some bad breaks last season with injuries and illness, and so hopefully he is able to get some minutes and take another step forward because, as I said, going forward, he's going to be an important piece. The other guy that just kind of keeps popping into my head as I think about this season is Xavier Johnson, because we saw earlier this week there was a watch list that came out with 20 players for the top point guard in the country entering the season. Not a single Big Ten player on that list, which I don't. I haven't gone back and done the research, but I'm pretty sure it's been a long time since that's been the case. Kind of speaks to the theme that Dylan Burkhardt and I have. Dylan Burkhardt of UM Hoops. Every year we go through in the summer and in the fall, we rank our top 25 Big Ten players going into the season. We didn't have a Big Ten point guard really all that high compared to where we normally. I think Xavier was the highest we had. We had him 9th. A lot of times you'll see a point guard in the top 5 or so. Tyler, what does Indiana need from Xavier Johnson this season to reach its ceiling as a team? Is it just consistent play and more of the Xavier Johnson we saw late in the season last year and less of the Xavier Johnson that we saw at Wisconsin? And do you think he can be that with more consistency, or at this point in his career, is it foolish to expect him to change? This is his 5th season of college basketball. A lot of people would argue he is what he is as a player at this point.
No, I think he can gain the level of consistency that he did towards the end of the season. I feel like something that Mike Woodson seemed to harp on and that maybe was somewhat overlooked is just how much he demands out of his point guards. And I think I talked about this before, but it's just like there's more to the point guard position than people kind of see on the surface. It's not about just bringing the ball up the court and tossing it, tossing it and go run to the other side of the court. Mike Woodson wants, his point guards to know who has a hot hand, get them the ball, know who hasn't touched the ball in a while, get them the ball, know when the point guard, when to pick their spots of when they should shoot. There's just a lot more that goes in to the mental side of the game than I guess what some people may perceive. And I think we saw maybe a product of that, earlier in the season with Xavier Johnson trying to get a grasp of that. But then you saw late in the season when he was really rolling. I mean, he was really good. He was really good. And it seemed like he was kind of grasping what Mike Woodson was asking him to do. And really, it seemed like he was getting in a rhythm, especially in the Big Ten tournament. It just seemed like he was in that kind of flow state where it's just things were coming easily. Things weren't being forced. He was facilitating really well. He was getting to the basket. And then you had the pick and roll with him and Trace with the lobs that seemed like they really gained some chemistry with that. So I think that now having that time with Mike Woodson, so now he's going into year 2 with him, that knowing what he's going to demand, knowing what is expected of him, I think is going to be a big help in terms of his production. And because I think we saw that at the end of last season, like I said. So I think, and also just having the familiarity with guys around him. He's now played with these guys for most of the guys, a fair amount of guys on the team for a year. So he has that familiarity, that chemistry. I think, obviously things can change in there. I think he's going to be a more consistent version of himself than he was last season.
Last thing before we wrap up this week's episode, and obviously I'm looking forward to the coming weeks where we actually have games to break down and talk about and observations that we can look at. I want to ask you about North Carolina because you're the biggest North Carolina expert that I know. You're from Chapel Hill. You follow the team as closely as anybody I know, and Indiana's got that game coming up in about a month with the Tar Heels at Assembly Hall. We all know what the atmosphere is going to be like. North Carolina, we'll see what happens. I don't know what their schedule is early in the season or if there's a chance they lose before that game, but they're likely coming in as the number 1 team in the country. What do you make of the Tar Heels going into the season? I know you're obviously high on them after last year's run to the national championship game, but they've had some changes. some, I guess, may wonder if they can replicate the success that they had in the tournament last year after what was not the best regular season, but they did give them credit. They came together at the right time of the year and played their best basketball. They have mostly everybody back. They had, Pete Nance. I think he's going to fill the Brady Manick role from last year, and they've obviously got a lot of high hopes. So what are you expecting, just big picture, out of North Carolina this season? Is it national championship or bust? And what does that matchup look like when they come to Assembly Hall in late November?
Yeah, they return a lot of their production from last season. RJ Davis, Caleb Love, Leaky Black, Armando Bacot, just to name a few. And then they did lose Brady Manick, but got Pete Nance, who will fill in that. Also some freshmen coming in, highly touted Seth Trimble. I think their hopes are. I think RJ Davis even said it was like it's national championship or bust for North Carolina, and they have the experience. They have not only the experience, but the experience going deep in the NCAA tournament now. And I feel like in a lot of ways, Caleb Love holds a similar role to Xavier Johnson in each of their respective teams, to where Carolina would go kind of as Caleb Love went. And there were times where he was inconsistent and Carolina suffered as a result of it. And when Caleb Love is on, it's really difficult to stop him. So I think looking forward to that IU UNC matchup, I feel like the big men matchup is going to be a wash. Like I think both big men on each, or the big men on each team, are both really good. So I think that might be a push in terms of production wise. I think it's going to come down to guards and wings. Can Indiana shoot from beyond the arc? Can Indiana stop Caleb Love? Because I think if Indiana can stop Caleb Love and RJ Davis from going off from deep, and they can somewhat contain them, I think they'll have a good chance to win. Now, if Caleb Love and RJ Davis each go for 20 plus, I think it's going to be really difficult. So I think that's going to be a really good indication of where do Xavier Johnson and Jalen Hood-Schifino stand in their development. I think that's going to be a good indication of, is Miller Kopp going to be the shooter that IU needs him to be? So I think, to me, it's going to come down to the guard play, the wing play. Can Indiana stop the three? Can Indiana make threes?
Tyler Tachman, you're doing a great job right now at the Indy Star. You got a feature out today on Sydney Parrish. What else can we look forward to reading from you here as the season tips off? I know you're going to be covering, I think, a little bit of the women's team as well. You've covered some soccer. What's in the works here as the next couple of weeks go on? And maybe if you don't mind, just talk a little bit about the Sydney Parrish feature that you did and what you learned from that, because obviously we've got some listeners too that are interested in the women's program as well.
Yeah, Sydney Parrish went to Hamilton Southeastern, so she's local. Ended up going to Oregon for 2 seasons, and then transferred to IU. So you're being home, being close to her family was a big part of that decision. And as Indiana women's basketball continues to try to sustain the recent success they've had, it's sort of a transition, I guess I would say, going into this season. They lose Ali Padberg, Nicole Cardano-Hillary, Alexa Gobe, so they need somebody to fill that production. They also have Grace Berger and Mackenzie Holmes back, so that helps. But they're going to need some of the new faces coming in to fill that production. So Sydney Parrish, one of the pieces that could potentially do that. As far as what's coming on next, do people want to hear about football? Well, one of the bright spots I feel like in the season has been the punter James Evans. I'm working on a story about him. Really interesting guy and a really interesting story. He's from New Zealand. He came overseas to the United States, to Indiana. He had never visited Indiana before he came here. He said, like, when he was, trying to figure out whether this was a place to be, like, Google was kind of his best friend in like looking up things about the university. And So anyways, I think that's going to be coming out next week. So yeah, that's what I got going on.
Good stuff. Yeah, football at this point, I think has a chance to become a distant memory for fans pretty quickly once basketball starts up. And, you know, I don't know what the long-term future there is with IU football, but it's only going to get tougher with more teams coming into the conference, and they've got to find a way to at least become a little bit more competitive. I mean, I'm not saying they're not competitive, but they've got to figure out a way to try to get in the middle of the pack. I think for them in the Big Ten moving forward, that's a good goal to try to reach. It's not really asking too much, but when you look at this program historically, it's been rough sledding for a long time, and Tom Allen, as I said in last week's show, I think in terms of the person that he is and the leader that he is, I think he does a lot of the right things. But at the end of the day, it's about how many games you win and how many you lose, and the momentum right now for them is not heading in the right direction. So hopefully they can turn things around, maybe win another game or two here down the stretch. We'll see if that happens. In the interim, we'll have everything covered this weekend from Assembly Hall for the exhibition opener. Tyler will have you covered as well over at Indy Star, and we will be back next week with another episode of Podcast on the Brink.